Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Laura Murphy, Professor of Human Rights and Contemporary Slavery at the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice at Sheffield Hallam University in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much, Laura, for connecting with us today. We know that it's a little bit late in your time zone. Laura is an accomplished researcher and author, pushing forward questions on human trafficking and the experiences of survivors. She serves as the HEAL Research Chair and has partnered and consulted with organizations across the board, from the World Health Organization to our funder, the Office for Victims of Crime. Today, we will learn about how to connect with labor trafficking youth, and we will hopefully be very inspired by all of the amazing research that Laura has provided, and information on her materials will be accessible throughout this presentation. Over to you, Laura.
Hey, Charlie, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to have a chance to talk with you all. Why don't we go to the next slide? The big goal here today is to focus in on labor trafficking of domestic minors and to think about specifically, how do we capture their attention? How do we get education to them? How do we do outreach to them? We know that a lot of people do outreach regarding labor trafficking for people who are in immigrant communities. They often think mainly of adults. When people do outreach on human trafficking in general, they tend to focus on sex trafficking, especially when it comes to minors. And so what we're trying to do today is to expand your lens on the population of people who might be trafficked, to help you understand how labor trafficking affects U.S. minors as well as a number of other communities. Could affect anyone, really, and to help you identify opportunities for outreach to youth, American youth, and regarding labor trafficking specifically, and to think about strategies for getting their attention so that our outreach efforts have a payout, that they actually help the people we're hoping to assist. Next slide. I'm coming to you as a person who has done a lot of research specifically on the nexus of homelessness and human trafficking. I did research in New Orleans, and then I expanded that research to 10 US and Canadian cities, through which, through that project, I interviewed 640 homeless youth and talked to them about their experiences of work. And the questions that I asked them about work, we can talk about a little bit later, but I asked them a lot of questions about dangerous work, coercive work, work where they were expected to lie, work where they expected to be paid a certain amount, but got paid a different amount, all to try to ascertain from these young people what the experience of people, typically domestic minors here in the US, what their experience is when they're out there trying to locate work, try to get a job. Young people, some of them had become homeless because of a situation of labor trafficking. Some of them became trafficked because they've been homeless, but all of them have been young people living in the United States, going about their business when they were confronted with an opportunity for work that turned out to be too good to be true. And so I want to talk about those experiences briefly. If you were with us last week, I kind of gave a more in-depth description of how labor trafficking does happen to US domestic minors. I'm going to review a little bit of that material today, in part because not all of you were here last week, but also because I know as a professor, it's always good to hear things more than once. But a lot of the research that I'll be bringing to you today will be based on that work that I did with these minors across the United States and Canada. But I should tell you that there's not enough research going on for this population now. So a lot of questions people will ask me that are about, well, what are the trends in where young people might be recruited into jobs that end up being labor trafficking? What are the trends? Like, what cities are really at risk? These kinds of questions we simply don't know enough about to be able to answer with any real specificity. But I will tell you what we do know, talk about some things that we should be thinking about, and help you to work to incorporate a labor trafficking lens into your existing outreach strategies based on this research. Next slide. Oh, and I should say, I am in the UK, as Charlie said. I'm in the I'm in the UK. I teach now at Sheffield Hallam University, but I was previously at Loyola University where I did most of this research, and I did it in conjunction with Covenant House International. And so, but now it's dark here behind me because it's dark all around me. So it's late at night here, not late at night, 7 o'clock. But it's great to be able to have a chance to share this all with you. Next slide. So I know you've all seen this, the definition of labor trafficking and the definition of trafficking, but it's really important that we review it. It's important that we continue to remind ourselves that when we're talking about trafficking, we're not just talking about the worst ever possible job you've ever heard of, or that terrible thing that happened to a girl down the street. Or honestly, as a lady called me one time and said, I think trafficking's happening next door. Their children and parents are cursing and saying swear words everywhere. And I was like, no, that's just life. That's not trafficking, right? Like, we've all encountered situations where people think a white van passing by means there's trafficking going on. And so I think it's really important that we rehearse this definition often, especially when we're coming to a time when we're going to refocus our trafficking lens on a new population or a new form of trafficking or a new industry that we haven't thought about it before. And so I always want people to go back to remembering that trafficking is about force, fraud, or coercion, at least when we talk about it in legal terms. In sociological or psychological terms, we could talk about trauma, and we will. We could talk about the experience of subjection. Like, there are other ways to think about it, but when we come down to it, when it comes down to how we define it by law in the United States, we're talking about force, fraud, or coercion. Force is when it's physical violence. Fraud is when someone cheats on contractual matters, and coercion is psychological violence. And we see these force, fraud, and coercion elements in labor trafficking, even among domestic minors. Next slide, please.
Meet Alex.
Let's watch this video.
Meet Alex. Alex recently ran away from a bad foster home. Maybe Alex was abused or came out to parents who didn't approve. Maybe Alex's foster services ran out, or he was simply tired of being treated like a child. Alex asked the social worker for a new family, but was told he was too old. He went to a homeless shelter, but was told he was too young, and besides, no beds were available. Homeless, broke, and scared, Alex began searching for a job. Some homeless teens do find good work, but many are taken advantage of by someone with a welcome smile, promising fast money or a place to stay in return for work like farming, babysitting, magazine sales, or modeling. But they never get paid for their work. Sometimes youth like Alex turn to survival sex to meet their basic needs, or they're lured into the commercial sex trade. Researchers at the Modern Slavery Research Project at Loyola University, New Orleans, recently interviewed over 600 homeless youth at Covenant House shelters across the U.S. and Canada, and met people just like Alex time and again. In fact, 1 in 5 of those youth had been forced to work against their will or lured into trading sex by someone who took advantage of.
Next slide, I suppose. Let's see. So what I want us to, that video is a sort of an explanation of what we found as we were interviewing 600 youth in homeless shelters across the US and Canada. And I wanted to show you that video in part because we're going to use it as part of our way of learning about this issue throughout the training, but also because I think it gets at some of the major aspects of force, fraud, and coercion that we wanted to talk about. The idea that a person may lure you into a kind of work that you think might be legitimate, but then it turns out to be unpaid. That could be the fraud that we talk about when we talk about fraud, or that somebody might threaten a young person and make them feel like they can't walk away from the job. That would be coercion. And we see that in a lot of different industries. We see young people who are being told that if they leave, they still owe a debt, and so they can't They can't actually walk away from their job. They're told that if they leave, maybe someone will harm a family member or harm a child. These are things that are familiar from other forms of trafficking as well. And then those threats sometimes become reality. They become real violence. And that's when we talk about force. So that force, fraud, and coercion is what's critical and essential to how we define what's trafficking. And so when we interviewed these young people about their experiences of work, and almost all of them had had terrible work situations. We talked to young people who had worked in construction and fallen off of ladders. We talked to young people who worked in refrigerator rooms where they were cold all the time and couldn't shake it. We talked to people whose bosses sold drugs. We had talked to people whose colleagues gossiped about them. So many young people, when they go out to find work, they have to work in the shabbiest jobs. They work in jobs where people do not respect them, where there's very little dignity, where there's very little pay, and they often feel exploited. But where it comes to being trafficking, and that's all bad. I'm opposed to all that. And it's important to note that young people should not be treated this way as they're trying to grow into adulthood and take responsibility for their lives. However, when we are talking about trafficking, we're talking about those situations typically where young people cannot walk away from their job, where they feel compelled to stay by terror, by a fraudulent contract, or by actual violence. And when we talk to these 600 young people, 8% of them had had an experience of labor trafficking. And I think that people are surprised to hear that nearly, 1 in 12 of the young people we talked to had had an experience of labor trafficking. And there's no exception to the labor trafficking clauses like there is in the sex trafficking clauses that say, if you're under 18 and engage in voluntary sexual commercial sex, then you are also considered trafficked. That doesn't exist for labor trafficking. There's only the force, fraud, and coercion. And you'll see here, you probably look here and say 14 plus 8, that doesn't add up to 19. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But the reason that number is 19 is because there were 3% of young people who had been trafficked for both labor and sex. Their trafficking experiences overlapped. So the overlap typically occurred when someone was forced to trade sex and forced to sell drugs and did both of those kinds of work under force, fraud, or coercion. And so we can see that labor trafficking doesn't happen in a vacuum entirely either. And we can talk more later about where those overlaps might happen and where the overlap in your outreach strategies might also address that overlap. So 8% of the young people we talked to were labor trafficked. Let's go to the next slide. It's important to note that LGBT youth and youth with a history of foster care were overrepresented in this population. So whereas 20% of the population of foster care youth are trafficked, I'm sorry, I got all of that smushed together, where 20% of young people are likely to be LGBT by general statistics. 29% of them have been trafficked. And like other populations, 8% of them were trafficked for labor. Youth with a history of foster care had an even higher rate than the average young person. They had a 10% chance of being trafficked for labor and a 23% chance of being trafficked for any kind of trafficking. So these two communities are at particularly high risk. And when we did this study, we asked ourselves, why is it that young people who are LGBTQ or have a history of foster care, why might they be at higher risk? Why are they experiencing more trafficking? And part of the reason, and we can go to the next slide, is because of the intersectional vulnerabilities that those two groups experience. So we talked to young people who, when they came out to their parents, they were either kicked out and therefore they ended up homeless and were desperate for work, ended up taking work that they could have recognized as sketchy, but they couldn't. They just had to take the job. They couldn't deny that job. And that job ended up being a job that was tantamount to trafficking, that had force, fraud, and coercion, held them in that job. Or they experienced discrimination when they went to work. We talked to many transgender youth, for instance, who said when they got to a job, they were treated entirely differently from the other people, or they would be turned down for job after job after job. And then they would be forced to take a job in an illicit industry, for instance, doing criminal activities for work. And were often vulnerable to being forced to do things that they didn't want to do. But otherwise, they just didn't feel like they had another option. Foster care youth, similarly, when they aged out of their foster care situation, did not have the support system or the education sometimes or the funding to be able to spot a job that was going to be exploitative, to be able to make a choice other than a choice that they thought might otherwise be sketchy. And so I tell these stories quite often that, you know, we talk to young people who said, I saw an ad that said, make $1,000 a week giving away cell phones. And I always say, well, you know, that can't be true. And often young people would say, look, I read this thing and I knew that didn't sound right. But what else did I have? I kept going to apply for a job and apply for another job and apply for another job, and people kept turning me down. And I had to make money. I had to find someplace to live because either they had aged out or they had come out, and that left them vulnerable. But they're not the only young people who are vulnerable. Other young people who grow up in poverty, who have mental illnesses, who have inadequate education, homeless, who have no support network. I cannot tell you how many young people said, I just wish I had a support network. I heard it so often. But also young people who have a history of historical injustice. They're transgenerational injustice, like racial injustice or gender injustice, and they see their parents being exploited at work, or they've seen their own parents be trafficked, and they think that that's what work looks like. Many or people who had health disparities. We talked to young people who were disabled, as well as young people who had mental health issues, who were not in a position to say no to a job that was offered to them. And this is really where the crux of all this is, right? That what's happening when we talk about any kind of trafficking is that people are just trying to get a job. People are trying to find some way to make ends meet, to make a living, to stop living from pillar to post. I can't tell you how many times I heard people say, I just want to have someplace safe to lay my head, right? And so all of these vulnerabilities come together to make someone, to put young people in a position of engaging in work that might end up being exploitative. And people who would be willing to traffic, to be traffickers, people who would be willing to steal the labor of someone else, recognize those vulnerabilities. They see those vulnerabilities and they target them. So let's go to the next slide. Let's talk about where this kind of thing happens, where labor trafficking for youth happens. Among the young people I talked to, the vast majority, 81% of them 81% of those who were trafficked for labor have been trafficked to do work in some kind of criminal industry, primarily drug dealing. Some of them had been initiated into gangs and had been forced to do criminal activity that way. Some of them had been forced to rob or steal, carjack, steal copper wire. So criminalized work that is the way people are making their money, but that are in ways that is criminalized by our government. And I don't want anybody stealing my copper wire at my house either. Fair enough, but this kind of criminalized work was the main place where people were being labor trafficked. So we'll focus in on that a little bit today, as a little bit more zoomed in. But also it's important to remember that I did one study among one set of young people, and there are a lot of industries and venues in which young people can be trafficked for work. For labor. So I talked to several people, for instance, who had been forced to work in a domestic situation. So cleaning, babysitting, like cleaning of hotels, things like that. I talked to one person who had gotten involved in a relationship that she thought was great. And very quickly, with a much older man, very quickly it became clear that he had seduced her so that she would clean his house and take care of his kid. He was a single dad, and she was there to take care of his family, and that was it. And when she wanted to break up with him, It wasn't a matter of breaking up. He told her she couldn't leave, that she worked for him, that she was going to stay there. He held her captive. And so you can also see where there's like also potentially overlaps with intimate partner violence, domestic violence, sexual assault that could overlap with labor trafficking. But there are also situations where people have been on babysitting crews where they're not allowed to leave. A situation that I talked about last week in which a young woman had been brought in by a pastor and convinced that she should continue to work for him, taking care of his special needs child and cleaning his house, and wasn't allowed to leave and wasn't allowed to go. Well, she went to school, but she couldn't do anything after school. These are real situations that do qualify as trafficking if someone is, compelled to do that work through force, fraud, or coercion. We also talked to a lot of young people who had gotten involved in commission-based sales, where if you sell a certain amount, you make a certain amount of money. Typically, those sales crews work on a pyramid scheme facade that you're gonna work your way up and you're gonna become wildly rich. And that's, it's basically never true. And but young people become very enamored because there are pep rallies and prizes and things that make it look like these schemes are going to work for them too. And so they feel like they're special, they're part of a group, they're part of some kind of project, and they become very enamored of these situations. And then what happens is they end up being in debt bondage. So they're told, well, you've accrued this debt. We've helped you travel across the country to get to the site where you're going to sell things. We've paid for your hotel room. We have paid for your food, and now you owe us money. And so you're not making any money. Right? And then they're told, well, you can't walk away because you owe us this money. That's called debt bondage. And young people are experiencing this, but they don't recognize it as that. They just think, oh, that was a really crappy job and it's really terrible that happened to me, and they move on. And, this can happen in restaurants. It can happen through forced begging. That's actually a thing that happens from time to time, but it can happen in any number. This is a non-comprehensive list. It can happen in any kind of industry where a young person might be recruited to work. And one thing I want to emphasize is that young people who have been tricked and exploited and stolen from, had their wages stolen, they feel even more vulnerable. They are traumatized by it. So I think we need to, and I emphasized this last week, that they need to be approached with the same kind of trauma-informed care that we approach, well, I hope anyone that we work with, but in particular people we know who are trafficked. We want to make sure that we recognize that even when young people put on a false or a significantly real bravado, that they may be hiding, they may be repressing shame and anxiety and fear, their resistance to going to find another job, maybe because they had such a bad work experience before, maybe that they had actually been trafficked. And so it's important for us to reach out to young people, to help educate them about the possibility of this kind of situation, and to help connect them to our services, and to help them understand how it is that they may be targeted. So let's talk about how traffickers target young people. Let's go to the next slide. The vast majority of young people I talked to who had been trafficked had fallen for the promise of fast money. And which of us really is willing to just turn away from somebody saying, no, look, really, you can make $1,000 a week. I would take that opportunity, it'd be great. But young people especially have never fathomed that at 16, 17, 18 years old, they're gonna make $50,000 a year. It's not in their dream book. So people who are going to try to recruit people into a forced labor situation use the tactic of fast money. They put out job advertisements that say make money fast, sell cell phones, or become a model, or sometimes it'll say sell sex. That happens too. But there's a promise that there's going to be big money. Sell magazines door to door. You're going to make big money, right? And those false promises lead to them thinking that they're going to make it big. Oh, here's a case that I think is interesting. I talked to a number of young people, young men primarily, who had been living in the rural areas of Atlanta. or of Georgia. And they decided they wanted to move to the big city. And I talked to several people who thought they were going to become musicians. They were going to do rap. At the time, it was the trap scene was very big in Atlanta. And they were all going to go lay down trap beats. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, but anyway, they were going to go record trap music. And they showed up in Atlanta, and I heard stories from several different people that when they got off the bus, there were people there who were like, we can make you a star, right? They didn't even have to look for an ad. They got off the bus in the city and people knew that young kids, 16, 17, 18 years old, getting off a bus by themselves, looking like they're, eager, like new kid from the rural areas, were easy targets. And so they were told, oh, let's go do this. And like some of them ended up getting involved in jobs that they didn't want to do, getting pulled into work that they didn't want to do. Some of them just made beats for these people who were producers who then stole their beats. Now, I don't think you can go to the DOL, the Department of Labor, and say, this guy stole my beats, I want to file a labor trafficking case. But I just want to point out how these kind of, in a moment where a young person there feels empowered, I'm moving to the big city, I'm going to make something of myself. These folks, these traffickers, these would-be traffickers, these people who are willing to steal from young people, recognize those vulnerabilities and know that they can trick them, they can steal their labor or steal their beats, right? And so this happened over and over again. It also happened where people were expected to like smuggle things or carry drugs for people, where their family promised them like, oh, we'll be able to help you out if you just do this thing for us, but then they end up in some kind of illicit work. But so often it comes in the guise of someone posing as a benefactor, somebody saying, I'm going to be the person who's going to help you make it big. And young people are so eager for that. They're eager for mentorship. Even a young person with a great support network is eager for a new mentor. Somebody will help guide them into their adulthood, help guide them into the industry they're interested in. And so, next slide, please. So people who would, are willing, are interested, or are doing this kind of thing to try to engage somebody in forced labor, they go after them in the places where they know young people are hanging out. They find them online. They go to, online job websites because they know they're looking for work. They're looking for people who need a buck. They go, they target them on social media. They just roll up to them in their car on the street and at bus stations. I am no kidding. I cannot tell you how many stories I heard where somebody just rolled up in a car and said, hey kid, are you looking for work? When they saw a kid who looked down and out on the street by themselves. They're also targeting them where they know vulnerable people are going. They target them outside of homeless shelters. And that is a hard pill to swallow for those of us who are trying to do good and help young people in these places. They target them outside and inside homeless shelters. They target them at government assistance offices where they're going to get their social security check or to get the help that they need. I cannot tell you how many people I talked to who had been approached by someone who offered them a job that was too good to be true in one of the places they were going to receive help because they were vulnerable. Next slide. In fact, of the 640 some odd young people I talked to, 91% of them had been approached by someone offering lucrative work opportunities that turned out to be fraudulent or scams or even sex trafficking. Now, not all of those things ended up being tantamount to trafficking, but many of them were scams that were very dangerous, that stole all their money. Young people are being approached all the time with these kinds of scams. And sometimes they're in a situation where they think, I just got to take a chance. I got to see if this will work. Next slide. So how do we reach young, vulnerable youth? And let's be real. I mean, the nature of humanity, of human life, is vulnerability. We are all vulnerable. And so really, like, how do we make sure to protect young people? I want us to go through a little exercise where we repeat parts of the Meet Alex video and think about how we might do it. I'm gonna show a little piece of the video, and then I'm gonna ask you to write in the chat how you think you might address the question I'm asking. So let's go to the next slide and watch a tiny piece.
Meet Alex. Alex recently ran away from a bad foster home. Maybe Alex was abused or came out to parents who didn't approve. Maybe Alex's foster services ran out, or he was simply tired of being treated like a child.
So let's take a break, stop it there for a second, and ask ourselves, when we think about vulnerabilities, how might we build our outreach around what we know to be the vulnerabilities young people are facing, young domestic minors here in the United States? How do we shape our outreach around vulnerabilities? Could you write some things in the comments, and I will sort of process them as you write. How do we shape our outreach specifically to address the vulnerabilities young people might be experiencing, like some of the things we talked about a second ago? So Stacy mentions providing additional, great, thanks. I knew it would take a second. I'm ready to wait a little bit. So one of the ideas here is that we need to provide education for youth not able to go to school. That's right. There are too many kids in the United States who drop out or get kicked out of school and don't have an opportunity to continue doing it. And the programs that they're forced into are often awful. There's one in New Orleans that I went to do a presentation at where it was basically like a prison, and there were gates and barbed wire. Having real education is critical, and having that education incorporate things about, taking care of yourself, knowing how to, search for jobs, recognizing warning signs that a job's not working. All of this can be part of training. Meeting people's basic needs. It should go without saying that we need to do that, but of course we have to. I saw some services that are specific for LGBTQ plus youth and that recognize that they are very much more vulnerable than other youth to trafficking is a critical idea. Teaching life skills, having vocational training, having mentoring is all about that support network that so many young people told us that they needed to be able to do well. Having mental health services while in foster care, and also really guiding through that transition from foster care to being released from foster care, for aging out. These are things that we can do to address the vulnerabilities. But when we think about how we shape our outreach, we might think about training people in mental health services, training people in DCFS, training the people that are in life skills training, that are in job skills training, that are in vocational schools, that are in high schools, especially for high school kids who are most vulnerable or who disconnected youth. What we want to be doing is directing our educational efforts at these places that are already addressing youth vulnerability. So that we say, yeah, we know, for instance, that all kids are at school, but if we're really, we have limited opportunities to do our outreach and limited resources. So if we look at where our young people are most vulnerable, and then we target our educational and outreach projects, programs at those vulnerable programs that help those vulnerabilities, then we're likely to reach the most at-risk young people for labor trafficking. We also bring to the front of mind the idea that young domestic minors can be trafficked for labor. We make that a conscious thing for people who really have never thought about it. So few people recognize this as an actual possibility that it's a really good thing to start going to DCFS, talking to them about this, working with sports centers, community centers that you're talking about, the peer support groups, mentor groups, to let them know that young people who are forced to work are also trafficked. So that's one good way to think about it. Like, start with thinking about where are the people most vulnerable and direct your outreach at that. Let's go to the next slide. I think we have to press play.
Alex asked the social worker for a new family, but was told he was too old. He went to a homeless shelter, but was told he was too young. And besides, no beds were available.
So I want us to think about this. Alex, young people like Alex, many of the young people I talked to, they reached out to people who were supposed to be there to help them. Maybe they had been kicked out of the foster care program and didn't have a support network after that. Maybe they went to homeless shelters and found that, and especially for those who are under 18 or right on the cusp, especially young people who get kicked, who age out of foster care. People don't get kicked out, but who age out of foster care. They're in this weird place where often they don't really get the help they need. But all young people are like looking around for the kinds of services they might want or need, and to build that support network. And so I want you to think for a second and write in the comments, how do you imagine we could think about these referral systems that young people might be engaged in, the kinds of community building we want to create to be able to have strong referral systems? Who should we be reaching out to on that level? Who should we be building up collaboration with so that we can address, the needs of young people who are being labor trafficked? We kind of talked about some of them, but let's talk about some more. I love this. So Stacy, I'm a big fan of yours today. I cannot tell you how important it is that we start thinking about trafficking when we talk about jobs. Like we should be telling, places, people who are doing vocational training, even like air conditioning repair and computer tech service schools and things like that. Please keep giving me some ideas, but I'm going to riff on this one for a second. We should be reaching out to young people who are getting into those kinds of trades and helping them recognize the signs of trafficking. We should be talking to people who teach in those programs and get them to recognize the signs of trafficking. We need to be working on with job skills training programs to get them to recognize that trafficking exists and train young people to avoid it. Got a lot of silence up there. Oh, better business bureaus. That is super interesting. Jesse, I don't even know what to do with that. So I hope you'll expand on that in the next part. I mean, in the comments, because I'd love to hear more about that. Strengthen the use of tech to ease collaboration, access to referral pathways. I love this idea. We keep talking in New Orleans about having this collaborative social service referral network so that we can constantly be in connection and know what's available, what housing is available. And that kind of outreach is labor intensive because you have to be working with your entire community, really getting people on board, but it is so worth it. And it becomes a sort of collaborative outreach effort so that everybody is aware of what's available all the time to help each other. I think that, foster care should be able to give young people a lot of options and be able to help them through this transition to adult work. We're also, I'm just reading real quick. Leanne, I love you. I'm just going to read it. Leanne says, not just training folks on poverty wage jobs is a good way to provide prevention. This is great. We need to support youth access to different types of job programs. I'm so glad you said this because I can't tell you how many times I've talked to young people who had been told a million times to just go to Burger King to try to get a job. And they would go to Burger King. If they were transgender, they would often not be able to get the job. But beyond that, when they did get the job, maybe they worked at a restaurant, they worked at fast food, they made between $2.10 and $5.25. It's just unfathomable. A person can't live on that and they know it. And so we need to give them job skills training that our outreach should be to train them to do jobs that they want to do. I talked to kids who wanted to do hairdressing, they wanted to be cooks, they wanted to do all kinds of other kinds of jobs that were accessible to them, or should be accessible to them, but they didn't have that training. This is one way to do outreach. And all the while we're doing that, we're training them, we're preventing labor trafficking, but we're also training them to recognize what is a job that is treating them right. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to repeat ourselves a little bit here. Let's press play on the video.
Homeless, broke, and scared, Alex began searching for a job.
Oh, I cut that one a little bit too short. So tell me, at the next piece that happens, Alex is looking for a job, and people come at him with like opportunities to do babysitting and doing, drug dealing and doing farming potentially. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is like, where might we focus our attention when we really focus on the fact that what young people need often is work, is economic stability? What kind of outreach can we provide that would, or what kind of outreach efforts do we want to focus on if we want to really address that problem of their needing economic stability? Leanne was giving us a good start. She kicked us off on this with providing job skills training that get young people and just mentorship that get them into jobs that are more meaningful for them and might pay them something worth they're able to live on. And Jesse expanded on the question about business communities, like getting people that are in the business community to start helping people understand that this is actually going on. So outreach to the business community itself, so they recognize the signs and also don't do it. Having better independent living programs that give people a stable housing situation, which make them less likely to take a job that is dangerous. And helping to connect with solid employers that you know to be doing good work. So you can be doing outreach to collect a community of employers who are excited to work with young people and will provide mentoring and will help them see what a good, safe work environment looks like. Thank you for that, Megan. So when we look at job search outreach, I also want you to say, I want you to be thinking, where do we see traffickers approaching young people? They were on social media saying, make $1,000 a day. I see no reason why, if you run a job skills training program or a homeless shelter or a social service provider group, why you shouldn't get online and say, make $1,000 a day. Psych, that is never going to happen. If you want to get a good job, come to our job skills training program, or come check out what we have to offer at our educational program. And like connect with them at Job Corps. I cannot tell you, Stephanie mentioned Job Corps. Tons of the young people I talked to had been to Job Corps, but had nonetheless been scammed. And so working with Job Corps to help them make young people more resilient to these possible scams. Getting them into technical training when they're younger. Going to, I mentioned the Instagram. I think that we should be advertising on social media. We should be advertising at bus stations. We should be advertising at government assistance offices. We should be advertising at homeless shelters, at the places where young people convene, where they're vulnerable. Yes, young people are hanging out at parks, they're hanging out in after-school programs, they're going to school, absolutely. And we should continue our outreach there. But when we focus our outreach on labor trafficking, we should be thinking, where are they being recruited for work? On Craigslist with job ads. Get onto the job boards and say, we have an opportunity for you to come and work with our program and have a residential housing program that has a job skills training attached to it, right? Advertise the opportunities you provide as a service provider in the places where they're looking for help, and they're looking to get jobs. And you can be looking to connect with them there as well. And I really love that that Charisma said, also, we need to remove barriers to employment eligibility for youth who may have been justice involved. I love this. Thank you so much for saying that. There's so many barriers, and we should have that on the vulnerabilities list, right? Young people who have been justice involved are struggling even more to get jobs, and so we need to, and we should be reaching them in those places as well. So we need to, let's go to the next slide. We need to think a little bit outside the box when we look for places to do outreach. We can go to the next slide again. So yes, let's continue. Let's take the places where we're already doing research, outreach, where we're going to schools, we're working with child welfare programs, we're going to youth serving organizations. Let's add stuff to that programming, add that labor trafficking lens to that work. And then let's think about other places where we might also attack this problem, and think about the way other people are preying on their vulnerabilities, and think about how you might use those same venues like social media and government assistance offices as a place to promote the tools for resilience that you can provide them instead. Let's go to the next slide. One of the things I want us to remember is that not all advertising to young people, not all outreach is a good thing. And I'm just gonna be straight about it. There's a lot of outreach to young people that is completely ineffective and that is actually unusually prevalent in our movement in the work to end human trafficking. Let's go to the next slide. When you Google human trafficking, these are the first images that pop up. And they're not just the first images, they're the first 100 pages of images that pop up, because this is what we're currently using to describe human trafficking. And for too long, trafficking advocates have deployed these kinds of sensational images and very narrow images to raise awareness of human trafficking. And the truth is, what it ends up doing is actually reducing. Thank you, Sharon. Sharon asked my next question. Let's go to the next slide. Who in the world identifies with these images? Like, look at these images and tell me in the comments, like, how would you see these images? Would you see themselves in these images? Who would they think is a victim of? Here's the question that you can actually answer. Who would young people think, exactly, who would young people think are the victims of human trafficking if they saw these images? Alexis says, why are they all white girls? This is exactly what young people would think. Okay, so it's just young people, young women who get trafficked. And what do they get trafficked for? They get trafficked for sex, it looks like. They are typically, and again, they're white girls, and I cannot tell you can go for pages and pages and pages. And it's just pretty white girls held in chains, looking like they're kidnapped. And I haven't talked to you for even a second today about people being kidnapped. There hasn't been a single person I've talked to who's ever been in chains. This is not how trafficking works. And so most young people never imagine that they could have had an experience that was trafficking. And they certainly aren't going to tell you if they did think it was trafficking, because this is what they think you think trafficking is, because this is what the majority of anti-trafficking advertising looks like. Let's go to the next slide. If it doesn't look like that, it looks like this. What does this tell us trafficking looks like? What would young people think trafficking is about if they saw this Department of Labor? Looks like it happens to foreigners, or maybe it happens even just in another country, right? It happens in other countries. It happens only to non-US citizens. Also, most of these pamphlets that come from the Department of Labor and the major government agencies, USCIS, things like that, they often have like 1 million words on them. Like, even I look at it and think, oh, I'm not reading all that. And I read a lot, it's my job. And so it's just really, really hard to identify yourself. These people do not look like the young people we're talking about. Even just forced labor is a crime doesn't help them to see what forced labor is or what human trafficking is. And so we either have decided that trafficking is about people over there, right? Some people in some other country or people from some other country, or we've decided it happens to the prettiest white girls you know, and they're bound up, and so you'll never see them anyway. It's maddening. It drives me crazy that this is the kind of messaging that we're putting out. Let's go to the next slide. So here's one that I think quite works. I will tell you that I helped to create this one. But I'm also not very sensitive about these things. So I'd like to ask you, what do you think works on this, and what do you think doesn't work on this outreach material? I'll mention, okay, so the coloring, okay, you have to say, does it work or does it not work? Because I don't know if you're saying it's positive or negative. But I am glad that Marissa brought up in the meantime that informal labor sectors are not, if you're forced into criminalized labor, it's not going to be covered by DOL. So that's a real danger for young people. And that makes it hard for them to have somebody to think that they can turn to, or to think that the law will protect them. I like that Kelly Emmons said, the simple questions are good. I really like the all work and no pay, because anybody can think that that might happen to them, right? Like it's not, if you're working, you might not get paid. It doesn't have this sort of sheen of something really serious or terrifying. Where is my money? Like if you're not getting paid for work, you should be. And if you're not, we can help you, right? Just sort of makes it very clear. So it identifies the problem. Alexis, you said it doesn't work. Oh, the color doesn't work. So the colors are a little dark. I'll tell you that the colors are what they are, probably because it's New Orleans and our colors are black and gold. And that was actually meant to appeal to young people who like black and gold in that particular city. That's the Saints colors. And so I think probably you're right. In a lot of other cities, a brighter set of colors might be more attractive to young people, but in that city, it's a special thing. So not having too many words, like you don't want to dumb it down to where nobody knows what you're talking about, but there's also the issue of having it be overwhelming and having people not want to pick it up. Catherine says it doesn't work because the photo of the girl looks like sex worker. Well, so, okay, that's an interesting point. This pamphlet is meant to cover both sex and labor trafficking. It's supposed to reach the most number of people. Let's go to the next slide because it's the inside too. And that's a really hard balance, like trying to figure out how do you get images here that are not sensational, that aren't girls being bound, that help people to see that it happens to women and men, that helps people to see that there are, that it happens to young and old people in the U.S. and people outside the U.S. It is a delicate balance. And I will say that I think that the New Orleans Task Force, go Saints, Jesse, the New Orleans Task Force, I think, did a fantastic job of trying to balance that. But it's something that we all suffer with. I got to tell you how often somebody's like, can you just get us a picture for your event that's like not your headshot? And I'm like, no, there's no pictures. I hate them. But how do you get people's attention? So having something simple, having it appeal to your local population, have a diverse set of possible identificatory markers. And if you were going to have one that was just about youth, you could and just about labor trafficking, you could really hone in on the particular kinds of questions you ask, the particular images you use, the particular colors you use. But most of all, steering away from that sensational imagery, moving away from it just being too much, and helping people understand that it could be happening to them, to help them identify. Let's go to the next one. I like that it says, you are not a criminal. Yeah, we believe you and you have rights. Thanks, Marissa. So let's do a little exercise where we try this out and we think about where we apply what we've learned. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, Carlene, I don't think we have, but that's a great idea.
Meet Sam. Sam is 16 and lives in your local city. He likes to spend time with his friends, and his favorite subject in school is science because he likes understanding how things work. Lately, Sam has been leaving school early and has recently been arrested for selling drugs. Due to his drug offense, Sam is now required to participate in programming with you. During your first meeting, Sam shares that his friends won't let him quit. And after asking more questions, you realize that Sam's friends have been coercing him to sell drugs. Recognizing that this is labor trafficking, you wonder what would have happened if Sam would have had known the signs 8 months ago when this all started.
So let's talk specifically about, and can we just do it in the comments? Charlie, are you okay with that? Since we're used to it.
Of course.
Awesome, yeah. Now that we're got it going and have only a little bit of time. Let's think back, let's think specifically about a case where someone is involved in forced drug dealing, because that's a particularly hard one to work with because they've been criminalized or they have the potential of being criminalized. What can we do to what are the access points where we might have been able to influence Sam before he got to this point? Absolutely. We could have gone to talk to schools. He might have had teachers who would have known about labor trafficking, could have taught him about it, or could have recognized the signs. Help me, people. We only have a couple more minutes. Oh, somebody's on the Slido. Okay, great. A skillful investigator could have recognized the signs. It's true, but I think a lot of people don't actually know what's going on. And when we talk about investigators, often they see criminal or innocent. And so when we have a young person who's engaged in criminalized activity, but is nonetheless a victim, it is hard for a lot of people to understand that situation and to recognize the victimization in criminal activity. Yeah, addressing him directly about like, where does he live and what does he, does he live with the person who employs him and what's work like for him? Jesse talks about restorative justice programs are great for like bringing people together to talk about this kind of these kinds of issues and about the injustices that are that young people are experiencing. We've got information about having billboards that really truly make young people identify with that experience instead of that's on the billboard, instead of feeling disidentified with it. That's important, that like what's on the billboard really matters. Having signs up at the bus stop so he would know, like, an all work, no pay. Oh, by the way, you guys can borrow that material, and we can, Leanne, if you're still on, maybe you can put up where they can find that material. But having all work, no pay as at a bus stop might catch someone's attention instead of a girl in chains again. Educating law enforcement, having community PSAs, educating community leaders. Maybe when he was looking for a job, he could have seen an advertisement on Craigslist for programs that were uplifting or positive, having more positive mentors and volunteers, not ending up in the counselor's office after he's admitted that he's been forced to do something, but having more supportive network even before it. Oh, Sean mentions that My Little Red is a great human trafficking info for kids to understand vulnerability. I didn't know about that. Pat asked, will you have the PowerPoint? It will be available to everybody afterwards. I think we're going to wrap it up. I think this is the end. Let's see. My slideshow was on the side here, but it's disappeared now. Yes, let's go to the next. So we named a lot of these things. Look at that: bus stops, community partner offices, hangouts where young people go to hang out, youth centers. We can be putting our advertisements that's truly meant to engage young people in these places. Next slide. We just have a couple more. We can reach out to their teachers, their community workers, our partners, and other people who are working on staff and in community organizations that we partner with. And next slide. And we need, as I said, to have those images be really focused on the kinds of things that young people will identify with. Leanne mentioned in the comments that you can find the All Work No Pay campaign materials there at the link, and that's the kind of thing that can be modified and changed and put different colors and have different stuff in your for your community. And I think I'm right when I say that Leanne and I are very happy to have people use it if it's useful. And we're not saying that this is the end all be all of advertising. It's just one way, or of outreach. It's just one way that people who are truly concerned about these questions put together a pamphlet that they thought might reach a wider audience and connect with people a little bit more. If you have questions, go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A. I'm here for another half hour. I'm happy to answer questions. I got to drink a lot of water. I'm a little dehydrated, honestly. But I'd be happy to answer your questions. It's been really interesting to get a chance to see your comments all throughout. But hit me with your questions. I'm happy to answer. And I should also mention, I'm sure Regina's about to say this, but I know some of you are going to have to go because we're at the hour and people have things to do, but I'm happy to stay and answer questions.
Thanks so much for that, Laura. And thank you, everybody. Yes, the chat has been so lively and we really appreciate all the participation. And actually, we do have, we received questions via chat. I saw in the Q&A. And then last week that, as was mentioned earlier, we did have a session that identified did more of the foundational, where you covered a lot of foundational information, but there were a lot of questions geared more towards this session. So we compiled them all, and we love to, I love to pose those to you, and, let's jump right in as people go ahead and take the opportunity to add to the Q&A. So the first one, and I saw that there's a question about education, which has been a very popular topic in, I think, both sessions. But the first one I want to start with is one person talked about that they're a community member. They're not part of a system. They're not part of a nonprofit, and that they're passionate. They use that word, but are struggling to get started. So and you introduced so many points, but are there special considerations if you are not part of a system, right? Or an NGO? How can someone from the community get involved in this work?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So I have like a bunch of things going through my mind right now. The first thing I want to say is I'm thrilled to hear, that people who are in the community who otherwise don't work with youth or don't work on trafficking are engaged by this issue and truly concerned and want to have an impact and do something important and good. So kudos to you for even being here as someone who's not working with youth directly. The one caveat I want to say is that a lot of times when people are first sensitized to this issue, to trafficking in general, but labor trafficking or sex trafficking, they immediately want to go out and pull a Liam Neeson style move and rescue some girls or something and throw people over their shoulder and run out and save them and shoot them up and stuff. This is not what we're doing. And in fact, I really want to say it's super important that those of us who work on this issue say clearly to community members that we do not want you to directly intervene in a situation that you think is dangerous or criminal. There are people who are trained to do that. There are people who are trained to do outreach, and there are people who are trained to intervene in dangerous criminal situations. Please don't directly intervene. Okay, that said, I feel like I need to say that because I've seen dangerous things happen, and I don't want to endanger anyone. But I would say the first thing you should do is see if your region has a human trafficking task force. Most communities do now, most big cities do. I think it's something like 48 states have human trafficking task forces. And lots of communities have unofficial, those are government funded human trafficking task forces. Many communities have informal human trafficking task forces. Type in your community name and human trafficking task force or human trafficking working group or something like that and see if there's a group there who's already doing the work. And go and first listen. Listen to what they're thinking about. Listen to the kinds of programs they're doing. See if they align with your values. See if they align with the kind of things you want to be doing. And then offer the skills you already have. Maybe you know how to do web design. If you do, we need you. Maybe you know how to do spreadsheets and you're an accountant. We need you. You may think that the skills that you have are not useful because you're not Liam Neeson. But it's not the Liam Neesons we need. We need people who can make good looking pamphlets. We need people who, right? We need designers. We need people who are good writers. We need people who are counselors and teachers to be spreading the word and seeing the signs. And we need people who are just engaged and in a position to say, I saw something, it didn't seem right. We'd like to, I'd like to direct this to the people who know, and also to be, talking to young people about safe jobs and to be mentors to young people who might otherwise not have those supports. So I always say to people, get in where you fit in. You may think that you don't have anything that you can contribute, but the hardest things that most groups that are doing this work have to come by is the kind of nitty gritty stuff that nobody thinks is that important. We need that. So please, get in where you fit in.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I realized I came up as this box out of the blue for the Q&A, and just want to take a second to just let folks know. My name is Regina Bernardin, and I'm the technical advisor for anti-trafficking programs at the IRC and support framework. So I appreciate the opportunity to be able to join this part of the session and have this dialogue and conversation with you, Laura. So
yeah.
We're going to jump into back, like I mentioned, education. right,
Yeah.
in the theme of education. And so there was a question that was posed, and it was upvoted as prevention education about labor trafficking, also workers' rights for youth would be great.
Uh-huh.
Are you aware of existing prevention material that includes labor issues with youth?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just did guidance. Guys, I don't know if you can find it. I'm going to try to describe it so you can Google it while we're doing this. So the Family Youth Services Bureau of the Administration of Children and Families just put out guidance that I helped them to put together. And I'm saying it's hard to find because today I tried to find it for someone who's on this very call, and their website was down. But so try Family Youth Services Bureau. And they recently came out with a prevention guidance, and that is based on sex and labor trafficking. Everything, also, if you happen to be a federal grantee for any of the homeless youth services programs, there are a bunch of guidances that we help to create based on this research there about addressing labor and sex trafficking for young people. Actually with FISB, we created one labor trafficking and one labor trafficking prevention handout also at Family Youth Services Bureau. If we don't find it now, I will make sure that we get it for your handout that you get after this. But like in the last 3 years, I've probably, this is just what I did. So like I've probably done 5 different things with Family Youth Services Bureau and with the national, gosh, it's so many National Human Trafficking, yeah, so many acronyms. Yeah, the National Human Trafficking Technical Assistance Center. I've done like 5 of those, just helping them to build things that are really geared not only towards sex trafficking, but to labor trafficking. But there's an overlap, right? When we talk to young people about, and we said this last week, but I'll say it again, when we are talking about preventing trafficking, we're talking about preventing people from being compelled to do work against their will. Now, some people don't believe sex work constitutes legitimate or dignified work. That's a debate. But when it comes to trafficking, we're talking about people being compelled to do labor against their will. And so the questions are kind of the same. Do you feel like you can walk away from your job? Do you feel like, or like from the situation you're in, do you feel like you can, that you're getting paid for the work you're doing? Is somebody else getting the pay that you're supposed to be getting? And the prevention efforts are similar, although not identical. They're similar in terms of reaching out to people where they are, where their vulnerabilities lead them, thinking about having images that they identify with. All of these things are in those guidances that we've provided over the last few years that I think really update what was originally a group of people who were very focused on sex trafficking.
That's excellent. And actually, there are a couple more questions on the Q&A that focus on the development of materials. So we're going to continue with that. One of them asks, let me see. Well, I guess we'll combine them. So do you have any outreach material that targets youth directly? So for example, something like a well-designed small business card poster or something for social media that appeals. Now, the other question, but ties to this, is do cards or flyers work better? So I guess a combination of what is available and what works better for this population.
You know, I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not afraid to say that. My guess is with 70 people still on this call, there are people who do know the answer to that. And I would love to hear it. I will tell you that as a researcher, I'm always reticent to say cards work better than if I don't have a study that actually showed it. But I see Jessie saying she likes cards. I can only read the very top of it because you can hide them away. And I think that's true. I've seen outreach efforts for sex trafficking that were specifically on chapsticks or mirrors or things that seem innocuous. And it's very possible that that might work. Alexis says that she actually has experience with youth in her program that actually prefer wallet-sized options. You know, the truth is, when we were working on the New Orleans one, the idea was that we would put it in places where people gather and not sell it as a human trafficking awareness thing, but sell it as like, Everybody's worried about not getting paid for work. Like, I can't tell you how many people in New Orleans are underpaid. So the idea, the goal, and we didn't do any study to see who took the pamphlets or who reads it. We don't know. So that's hard. As a researcher, my gut is always to say, well, I don't know if I don't have a study to back it up. But the goal was to say, I'm going to grab that. I would, if I were sitting in a hospital, or I was in a community center, or I was waiting for somebody at a bus stop, and I saw all work and no pay, I'd be like, I am tired of getting paid too little. And I would check that out. And that was our goal, was to say, like, people who are feeling like they're like getting cheated. And I cannot tell you how many people are feeling like they're getting cheated at work in New Orleans. I mean, it's just a tough environment employment wise. We wanted them to grab it, because even if they're not being trafficked, we want them to know what labor trafficking is. We want them to know it when they see it, so that if down the line, even if they just crumpled it up and threw it away, it planted a seed. This is the goal of outreach, right? You plant the seed, the seed of prevention, because you want to make it so that they might come to you later and say, I saw your pamphlet like 2 years ago and I was in a fine job then, but I realized this thing that's going on now is not right, is it? And they can come and talk with you about that. Leanne says, we intentionally wanted to be next to the domestic violence and sexual assault, homelessness pamphlets in waiting rooms and service provider centers, so that it would blend in, and purposely didn't include human trafficking on the outside, because we didn't want people to think, oh, that's not about me, right? And so that's part of why it's formatted and what it looks like, so that it would be there among those things, but wouldn't have the same kind of intimidating factor as being like, oh, I'm going to get up and grab a thing that says I'm a domestic violence victim. Like, nobody wants to see you grab that either. Nobody wants to be seen grabbing that necessarily. So this also didn't have a stigma attached to it, we hoped, and it would have that sort of appeal to make people think about what they're thinking. Okay, so Megan says she's not finding the FISBE guidance, but I promise you we will get it. I have copies of it if nothing else, but I'm hoping we'll be able to direct you to the websites, because there's all kinds of apparatus for that stuff. And there are probably a lot of people here. Please do not hesitate to, I see you, Regina, to if you have your own suggestions. I'm only telling you about ones that I know of that I help to contribute to, but please, please, please put in the comments other things that you think work or that you've had good experiences with.
Yeah, no, actually, I wanted to now touch upon a point that you made, and we had a couple of questions about this, is you mentioned stigma, and we had some questions around how do we also do this with a trauma-informed approach, right? So what is the best way in whether, and I know in your case, we talked about the development of material, but even just in our approach, in our outreach approach or advocacy approach and working with youth, how do we do it from, and both people who ask this use the term trauma-informed, which I love seeing that that's part of people's vocabulary. How do we do it? With that in mind.
So I'm going to repeat something I said last week, and I don't know if the people who are asking are people who are longtime followers, but I want to say it again because I think it's super important. When doing face-to-face outreach, so I'm directly with youth, direct youth outreach, and you're talking to a young person who you want to either sensitize to the idea that labor trafficking is something that could happen to them, or because you think they might actually be at risk or actually be being trafficked. It's important to make it clear that the situations that they're potentially in, or the situations you're describing, are not extraordinary. They don't happen only to them, that they are things that you've seen before and that you recognize, and that you don't carry a stigma. You don't think that it's embarrassing or bad for them to have had those experiences. And so one of the things I mentioned is that when I talk to young people about their situations of work, one of the things I explain to them is that I think anything you do to make a buck is work, right? And so you might call it a hustle, you might call it a side hustle, you might just call it roll it on people, you might call it dealing drugs, you might call it selling your body. But if you do it to make money, I'm going to talk about it as work. And that's because I want you to be able to talk to me about how people have treated you as a laborer, and how they may have mistreated you as a laborer, right? Because we have laws that prohibit that. And they're laws that are, baked into our labor codes. And so when I talk to young people, I say, there's actually like a speech that I said like 600 times when I did these interviews. And I said, basically like, look, when I talk about work, I'm very open-minded. Thank you, Marissa. I'm very open-minded. That is actually the exact thing that I was looking for, Marissa. Thank you. The prevention brief. So I say, when I talk about work, I am very open-minded. I don't care what you did. I do not judge. If you are trying to make a buck, trying to make some money, I call it work. You might have a job that where you've got a boss named Brad and he wears a button-up shirt, and he's got a name tag, and when he pays you, he prints it out on a dot matrix printer. You probably don't even know what a dot matrix printer is. And then you get the check, you cash the check, it's your money. It's like legit, right? But you might also be doing things like you might not have, your boss might not have a collar. He might be your dad, or he might be your uncle. Your boss might be your boyfriend or your girlfriend. Your boss might be some lady down the street. You might get paid in Cheetos. You might get paid in, exchange for living at somebody's house. You might get paid with sex. I don't know. All kinds of things happen, but people work in different situations. They work in informal ways that aren't necessarily the ways a lot of people will talk about it. You might have, and this is the last part I say, you might have also sold snacks out of your backpack in middle school. I consider that work. If you got paid to do it, you were working. If you graduated from that and started selling drugs out of your backpack in high school, I also call that work. If you graduated from that and sold sex, I call that work. If you did something to make a buck, I call it work. Now, again, not everybody would agree with that, but I tell you what, if you tell young people that you get that they do all kinds of things to make money, and that you respect that can happen, and that sometimes, and I'll say this, sometimes we do work that we would not choose if we didn't need to make a buck. If you explain those things to them, they're much more likely to open up to you and talk to you about the experiences they've had, even if they've done work in criminalized industries. And so that approaches them with a sense that you respect them and you understand that work has dignity for them no matter what. And then I also always frame the questions I ask them with a sense that it's not an extraordinary thing that they've done, or that the kind of work that they perform. So I'll say sometimes young people will get into jobs that they otherwise never would have taken if they didn't need the money so bad. Have you ever taken a job that you thought was too dangerous or very unsafe? Tell me about that. Have you ever, sometimes young people will take jobs that they wouldn't otherwise take. Have you ever taken a job where you thought the boss wanted you to lie about what you were doing, or where you thought there was some kind of cheating going on, right? So I frame it so that young people recognize that they are not alone, that this happens to a lot of people. And that kind of trauma-informed approach helps to get them to have a sense that they can trust you, that what they're going through is not alone. And I think also one other thing that I want to say is that recognizing that there can be shame, there can be anxiety, there can be a real trauma that follows the experience of being stolen from or cheated or harmed or abused at work in the same way as that happens in sex trafficking. This is super important. And so all of these things where you respect the experiences of young people, you also respect their ability to make decisions and give them options and allow them to have informed choices. This is all about that trauma-informed care approach that I think we really need to be using when we work with young people who've been labor trafficked or at risk of it.
Oh, excellent. As you talked about, because of that resistance, right, that we also find because of trauma, borrowing from that term that you used.
That's right. They may be resistant to thinking of themselves as being trafficked. They may be resistant to getting help, and they may also just not get it. They may just think, okay, well, that's just what work looks like, right?
Yeah.
And while we don't need to tell people, another thing that's trauma informed is we don't need to diagnose anybody. We don't need them to say that they're trafficked. What we need to do is address the issue, which is, what is trafficking? What is trafficking? What is trafficking? And then we can their vulnerability in the workplace, in the marketplace, in the job marketplace. And so that is all stuff we can do very respectfully and have very positive results.
There was a question from Stephanie that I think you answered in answering about trauma-informed care, but just in case there's something additional that you want to ask. And she mentioned that, her work is with youth that have criminal charges and are often also runaways, and some of them have been trafficked. Are there additional questions she can ask to dig deeper? I know that you talked about and share that wonderful script that includes that dialogue in which you are getting deeper and connecting and getting them to, it's more of, narrative versus this prescriptive list of questions, but just wondering if in that setting there anything additional that you'd like to add.
I think we have to be very aware that young people who have been criminalized have their walls up for good reason. They have good reason not to trust anyone because they know that some things that they've done could get them in trouble. They know that some things that they tell you have to be reported, and they know it better than we do a lot of times, right? Because they've been a lot of times through so many systems that they know how these things work. So I think it's really smart to say, okay, look, what are specific questions we could be asking in that situation, and what, and maybe this is not what you said, but like, what cautions do we take? How do we engage appropriately with young people who've been systems involved, basically the criminal justice system involved? And I would say that, the truth is, like, most of the young people who talk to me were just happy somebody even asked them about like criminal activity. Like, they had basically been taught to pretend like that didn't exist around adults. And so they were like, oh, let me tell you about this thing, right? They were so interested in my being interested in that. And but I had a very particular, I can't really answer that question entirely, honestly, because I have a very particular set of protections, which is that I am a researcher. They sign an informed consent form. I tell them that I will not repeat anything that they say to the service providers that they're working with, that what I do will not affect anything about their services, that I will never use their name. And in fact, I don't know their name. And so there, I have a very helpful ability to build rapport very quickly, because they can just purge all of this stuff and know that I can't tell anybody what I just heard, at least not by name. And so, unless, of course, they were under the age of 18 and were actively being abused, right? Or they were going to be a harm to themselves, that I did have to report, but that's why I interviewed people who are over 18. But so I would say that part of it is being aware that their caginess is a necessary function of their life. You know that. And that building that rapport is important, but that they also really do want to tell people about it. When you ask people, for instance, and this is a little bit different, but when you ask people about sex work who have engaged in sex work voluntarily, they are happy to talk about their work, right? They are happy to talk about making money. They're happy to talk about losing money. Like, often people will talk about the difficulties of whatever line of work they're engaged in, because you don't get a lot of time to sit and talk about those things, especially when everybody has decided those things are so stigmatized, that they're strictly traumatizing. And this is the other thing I want to say. Trauma-informed care means recognizing that some people aren't traumatized in the same way, that they're not breaking down, that they actually will talk about and can safely talk about things that might have harmed them, or that you think of as like the worst possible thing. And they're like, that is not the worst possible thing that's happened to me. That's just not the worst thing that's happened to me. And so recognizing that, like, especially when it comes to labor trafficking, yes, we need to have a trauma-informed approach, but that does not mean assume that everybody is entirely traumatized. I think that's an important point. And I know that we have to end, so I'll just end with, what will I end with? Did you have something else you wanted to end with, Regina?
Yeah, actually.
Okay, I'll let you end with something.
I was going to ask you one final question to kind of close us out.
Great.
You have to do an elevator speech, right? In which you ask, you have the opportunity to engage with someone. Why this population? Why focus their outreach efforts on this group? Oh,
because no one else is. No, I mean, because no one else is. Yeah. So why focus on this group? Any person anywhere in the world can be trafficked. But what we've done over the last 20 years, where through the efforts to eradicate or address human trafficking, is focus on a very narrow group of people. For the first 10 years in the United States, our efforts were largely directed at immigrant laborers in the United States and people who live, and even more people who lived in other countries. We assumed it happened elsewhere. For the second 10 years of the work that people have been doing against human trafficking, it has focused very narrowly on domestic minor girls, and surprisingly, like domestic minor white girls. It's been a very much like protect my granddaughter kind of movement it turned into. As a result, there are some people who've been left out. And so if you're gonna really put effort into this, you can rest assured that there are people working on the immigrant cases of trafficking. There are people who are working on international cases of trafficking. There are people who are protecting little white girls. You can count on it. And so where you might want to put your effort is on the communities of people who get overlooked and who don't get funding and who don't get recognized and don't get identified and don't get any kind of response. And I would say that includes domestic minor youth. It also includes adult women. It includes boys. It includes LGBTQ youth. It includes foster care youth, people who are aging out and coming out. Groups who are particularly vulnerable need more support, and we're basically overlooking them. So
that was beautiful.
I guess that's it.
Thank you. And since we're at the last minute, I'm going to ask Charlie to go ahead and close us out. Thank you so much, Laura. That was a great speech, great elevator speech.
I think that you two have given the audience everything that they need. Know that we will be sharing the materials afterwards, the recording and unanswered questions from this event. We will also try and share the links. And I just want to take this moment to thank Laura Murphy so much. You were absolutely fantastic. Audience members, you killed it.
Thank you.
This was amazing. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your resources. Thank you for your heart. And we will see you at our future events.
Thank you. And my email is there in the chat. If you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer you. As I said last time, I will not answer you within 10 minutes, but I will answer you in a reasonable amount of time.
Take care.
Thanks, y'all.